I hope you've had a great day. From talking to some of you and some people at the back, it sounds like you have. John, thank you for the very gracious introduction. What a gorgeous forum, isn't it? I look at some of the hearing rooms. I just stepped out of a hearing on Capitol Hill, which almost all of you, if not all of you, have been. It doesn't look quite like this. The other thing is, from sitting back here, you can see these airplanes go into Reagan and land, right? And John mentioned I used to be an Air Force pilot, and I watch those guys, and I think, dude, I'd much rather be doing that than this. It was a lot more fun flying and being in the Air Force than it was being in Congress sometimes. But Nancy has been a great friend and an advocate, as have you, John, and it's been an honor to work with you and your people over the last, as you said, 2 or 3 years. I know that you've been here all day, as far as I understand, and even if it's been a wonderful forum, which I'm sure it has, after a while, you kind of are tired and you want to go home. Maybe some of you are feeling that way. I will be brief. I was given, I think, 15 minutes. I won't take 15 minutes. I once heard a general, a friend of mine, say, and I thought it was very clever, he said, Julius Caesar was a great general, and he won many battles, but he gave long speeches, and so they killed him. And I don't want to do that. Interesting question as I kind of give you some thoughts on this. And by the way, I don't consider myself a subject matter expert in this. I'm more of a generalist. I'm more of someone who looks at this from a broader point of view, both as someone who served in the military, spent a lot of time overseas in Congress now, and especially my responsibilities on Intel take me all over the world. I mean, truly all over the world. From China, Beijing, to Moscow, to Africa, to the Middle East, and almost everywhere in between. How many, I'll be interested if someone can guess this. I asked this question from prime time. I make this point in one of the books I wrote. Any guesses? Demographers have tried to figure out since the beginning man, how many people have lived on the earth? Any guesses on what that number might be? Anyone at all? Come on, what do you think? 10 billion? A lot of people guess 10, 20, 30 billion. Sometimes people guess higher. I won't make you continue to guess. By their best estimate, and by the way, recognizing this is a very difficult thing to try to estimate. First place, when is the beginning of man? When did the history of man begin? But by generally accepted kind of consensus of descriptions of that and time frames, they think that something like 120 to 130 billion people have lived on the earth. That's a lot of people. Now, second question, how many of those people have lived under anything that we would consider free, or something close to however we choose to define freedom, something that is close to what we would consider that today? Of those 120 to 130 billion people, maybe 5 billion of them lived under circumstances that we would consider free. Now think about that. That puts us in an incredibly exclusive group of people. But I think the most remarkable fact, of those 5 billion people who have lived on the earth under freedom, 3 billion of them are alive today. And we truly live in a remarkable time. If you talk about the miracle of freedom, I think that's a good way to frame it and to phrase it. We truly live in a remarkable time. When we look at not everywhere in the world, but broadly, there are many, many people now who live under circumstances that we feel are recognized as being free, recognizing human dignity, human potential, the freedom to choose, in various ways. But something that those are the type of goals that we would achieve to. And you ask yourself, how is that possible? How is it possible that we live in a day like this today? And I think part of the answer, not all of it, but part of the answer is this recognition, as our founding fathers did, in the value of free press, free expression of ideas. And I'm going to close with a story that I think is a great illustration of that. You notice the First Amendment that guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of the press. You notice it wasn't the 8th Amendment, it wasn't the 4th or the 5th, it was in the First Amendment. And I think that was done by its intention. I don't think these guys pulled a number out of the hat and said, well, we'll order them in this way. It's a foundational freedom. If you lose that, you lose all others. You lose all of the foundation that the others are built upon if you lose this idea of free expression and freedom of the press. And I just really think it's that important. Thomas Jefferson has a quote that I'm sure that most of you, or maybe all of you, have said, that our freedom will be short-lived. It is a short-lived possession unless the people are informed. And I know that's what many of you have committed your lives and committed your professional careers to doing that. And we support you in that. I get asked questions all the time as a member of Congress. And I've distilled them down to, I think, 3 or maybe 4, maybe 5 very, very common questions. And if I were to have you guess what they would be, many of you would be able to guess some of them. One of them is, who's going to win the next election? Or some kind of political question. Is President Trump going to win in 2020? Or 6 months ago, are the Democrats going to take the House and take the majority in the House? And of course, people want to talk about elections, and that's part of my world. My work on national security as a former Air Force pilot, and my work on the Intel Committee, I'm asked all the time, what's the greatest threat facing our country? And it's a question we ask each other all the time. It's something that we want to evaluate and understand. But there's an interesting question that I'm asked in the last 2 or 3 years that I was never asked before. And it's almost spontaneous from people. It comes out many times in the course of conversation. It's not like they come up to me to ask me this question, but it's more organic than that. It just kind of sprouts from them. And that is, they say something like this, I don't know what's true anymore. I don't know what to believe anymore. Tell me how you understand what is real and what's not, what is true and what's not. And look, in our society, in our culture right now, that is a real concern for a lot of people, because we hear all of these different voices that come at us from all of these different sectors of our culture and our society, and many times they're telling us things that both of them can't be true. And that places a tremendous responsibility on many of you. Frankly, on all of us. And I don't just mean those of us who work in the political realm, or those of us who work in policy, or those of us who work in media or informing people. I think it's true of every American, true of all of us, but to truly understand, to try to understand what is real and what is not, to take the effort to differentiate between that, and then to help other people understand what is real and what is true and what is not. And I'm telling you, it is a real Achilles heel for our culture that our adversaries understand, and that they're very good at identifying and trying to take advantage of that. And they understand that a free society is by nature a fragile society, and that foundation, as I've already expressed, much of that foundation is built on this idea of the free expression of knowledge and information and ideas, and being able to differentiate between those that are real and those that perhaps are something else. And look, we used to call it propaganda. And some of our adversaries, when I grew up in the middle of the Cold War as a young pilot in the Air Force, I expected to fight the Russians in the Fulda Gap of Germany. And what I didn't expect is that they would be having an influence in our society in a way that they do now. But they've always been good at it, and they continue to be good at it. One other interesting statistic I think is worth mentioning, I'm sure, again, many of you know this. I found this very surprising. Only 13% of the population generally in the world today enjoys the benefits of living in a culture, society where there's a free press. Only 13%. And that's defined by coverage of the political news, or perhaps by safety of journalists, which is a concern I think that we all have to be willing to recognize. Intrusion of government or other political bodies into the dispersion of information and free discourse, and then finally legal pressures. And once again, that's not something that many of us saw coming. I think that's something it's easy for us to take for granted, and we have to recognize that we have to protect that everywhere, including in our own nation. Let me conclude with one last experience, and then draw, I think, a lesson from it, or at least a question. And this happened to me before I was in the military, or I'm sorry, before I was in Congress, but I was in a foreign country, and I'm not going to identify where, it doesn't really matter, but I will describe the circumstances there, and that is they're a nation that was not friendly to the West. And I don't want to call them an adversary because they weren't, but there are certain pockets within this country that certainly were. And there was a terrorist incident a short time before I visited this nation, and of the 19 terrorists that were implicated, about 17 of them came from this one neighborhood in the capital city. And I wanted to go down to this neighborhood and to try to get a sense for the people there and what their challenges were and what life was like for them. And my host didn't want me to, but he finally allowed me to, and we went down. And it's an old city, you know, some of it dating back to the 800s and 900s. And as I'm walking through the market there, it was obvious that I wasn't particularly welcomed. I didn't ever feel endangered, but I didn't, as I said, feel very welcome. And as I walked past one of these little alcoves built into the old wall of the city, I saw something and it caught my eye. And I turned and looked, and the reason I noticed it was because it was a poster, and it was written in English, which isn't the native language of where I was. And there was this old man who was watching over his money box there and minding his market, his stall in the market. And he'd put it up on the ancient timber behind him, and I started to read it. And as I tell you what I read, I'll bet I can read one word, or say one word, and most of you will know what I'm saying. Tell me if you recognize this. I started to read, and it started out fourscore. Do you know what it is? 7 years ago, Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And as this older gentleman and I looked at each other, he didn't want to talk to me, but he was proud to have that poster on display behind him. And here's an interesting thought about that. How did he know about Abraham Lincoln? How did he know about the Gettysburg Address? I can promise you it wasn't taught in his school. Where do people get these ideas from? And it's because of people like you. People who are willing to go throughout our society, throughout our own nation, throughout the world, and say, these are the things that matter. All men are created equal. The value of human life, the value of human dignity, the value of equality. And I wish I could say that those principles were taught and that they were embraced equally around the world, but the truth is that they're not. But because they're not, one of the challenges we have and you have is to try to help people understand and appreciate those principles. They can only do that if they know about those principles. And if somewhere someone is showing them. So John, to your work, if you want to read an interesting or see an interesting thing, as you know, and you and I have talked about, look at the influence of Russian media in different places around the world. I mean, RT in our own nation. How many people listen to RT? And I talked to some people once, oh yeah, I love RT, it's pretty interesting. I was like, dude, you know you're listening to Russian propaganda. I'm like, well, no, really? Yeah, RT, Russian television. They're not telling our story. They're telling their story. And in the influence of other ideas in the Ukraine, for example, and I could list dozens and dozens of other nations. It's important for us to tell our story. It's important for us to tell what we hope for people's future. That's what you all do, at least part of what you do. Thank you for doing that. It's an honor to be with you, to share a few thoughts. I don't think I took 15 minutes. If I did, go ahead and shoot me. As a bomber pilot, I was proud I'd hit a target plus or minus 1 second, right? So you certainly don't want to go over your time. Thanks for your being here and attending today, and to the Institute here for these great forums. We're honored to be a part of it. Thank you.